Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Suzanne Costello. I'm the CEO of the Institute of Public Health, and I'm delighted to be here today and to sponsor this panel discussion very shortly. I'd like to take the opportunity to congratulate Anthony and all the team at CCBS on their 25th anniversary. The IPH, like many North-South organisations, celebrated its 25th anniversary last year, so we appreciate how much of a milestone that is, and we're very grateful to the great work of the CCBS over that period of time. I love this conference. I come to it every year. I think it brings a unique combination of experience as well as expertise. And irrespective of your focus, your discipline, your area of work, I think all of us are joined by the fact that we're trying to make life better for everybody on the island. I'm really looking forward to the panel discussion in a moment, but before that we're going to have a short video which will explain the work of the IPH on the island of Ireland. Thank you.
The Institute of Public Health informs public policy to support healthier populations in Ireland and Northern Ireland. Set up in 1998, the Institute is jointly funded by the Departments of Health in Ireland and Northern Ireland. Our key priorities are promoting health and well-being, improving health equity, reducing health inequalities. We work to achieve these by focusing on evidence, policy, partnership. The Institute has a team of public health and policy development specialists based in Dublin and Belfast and undertakes work across the island, working towards healthier populations. Visit publichealth.ie for more information.
Give them a round of applause. So, good afternoon, everyone. I think it is afternoon now. So, and welcome to this second panel of the day. I'm Maureen O'Reilly, and we've all got bios, I think, in the brochure. But just want to welcome the panel members: Tom, is it Hanney or Hanney? Yes. Mary Bunting, Michael Darcy, and I think we have Martin Fraser joining us remotely as well. The theme of this panel really is just a discussion around North-South cooperation. So I think it's a fairly informal discussion, and we might, towards the end, if anyone wanted to come in with a few questions or even observations, because I know obviously everybody's got a key interest in this in terms of their attendance here today, just around what North-South cooperation means and what it means going forward. So would just also to say thanks to CCBS as well, and Anthony and Anne-Marie, Aidan, Trish and everyone in the team for organising this morning. What I want to do is, if it's okay, is just start off by asking everyone briefly just to outline what their involvement has been in North-South affairs over the years, because everyone on the panel has a different involvement. So I'll start off with Tom, just in terms of just an understanding of what North-South affairs you've been involved with in the past.
Thanks, Maureen. My main involvement was as Joint Secretary with Mary to the North-South Ministerial Council. Before that, I had been working on Anglo-Irish affairs in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and more recently I was the Irish Permanent Representative to the EU in Brussels, where I dealt with, for 3 years, the Brexit negotiations, which had quite a significant North-South dimension. So that was my main involvement.
You came out of it alive anyway.
More or less. I'm still in therapy, I think.
And Mary, your involvement over the years as well?
I became the Northern Joint Secretary of the NSMC in 2005 and kept that role until 2012, during which period there was a lot of change and a lot of hiatus and a lot of drama. But we got through, and the NSMC continues on, and it's lovely today to meet colleagues that I knew back in the day who are now still working away in that important area. But just to mention before we get into our main discussion, I just want to pay tribute to Tim O'Connor, who's here, and my former colleague Peter Smith, who died very suddenly this year. They basically did all the ploughing of the furrow to make the NSMC work, and we had to pick up and move on with that. So I just want to acknowledge the work that Tim and Peter especially did.
Well, I'm delighted to be here at the 25th anniversary, but I realise there's only possibly one person in this room, Chris, whose involvement in North-South might predate mine, which goes back about 4 decades at this stage. So I have many different elements of North-South that you're involved in, but I suppose fundamentally I've always tried to focus on this is a peace plus prosperity process. And very often the prosperity piece doesn't so much get left out, but doesn't get the kind of joined up attention with the peace dimension that it could or it should. So mentioning Tim O'Connor, indeed, my first encounter with the CCBS was the result of Tim when he invited me in 1999 to visit the fledgling NSMC setting up in the old hospital in Armagh, to tell me, as someone who'd been on this pitch already a couple of decades, what this new entity was going to do. And it was full of hope and optimism, and we really needed that then, because again, as the Minister mentioned, we were coming off the back of decades of no hope and no optimism and no possibility. And the message I brought to Tim that day was, at this time, if you remember, the first productive phase, the Celtic Tiger was roaring, but it had not spilt over the border. It had not engaged into the all-island economy that Sir George Quigley had been pioneering for a decade. And what I'd learned was North-South doesn't just happen. It has to be made to happen. And I think that's, for me, one of the key messages. Last point that day, Andy Pollock. Tim insisted we go round to an office to meet this guy, Andy Pollock, who I didn't know and I hadn't met, but I'd read. And he was sitting there at a desk in a room and not much else. And that was the beginning of the CCBS, not much except his drive, his ambition and his enthusiasm and hard work to make the CCBS work. And if I can mention one thing, that was the start of a lifelong friendship with Andy, and we still give an annual joint lecture to the political science students in Trinity. And what the lecture is like is the fact that we disagree cordially, even though we're going towards that same ambition. And I think that's, to me, what's embedded in all of us in North-South. That's what makes us the master chef, so to speak, of this area. As other people have said, we're managed to deal with differences, but we're all heading towards the same objective.
Yeah, I think that's what's interesting about, the cross-border bodies. It was really important that there were very specific remits, and you can see the success of that, in terms of CCBS, Intertrade Ireland, etc. And that's where I think, our conversation might take us in terms of, the role of the North-South Ministerial Council then, because it is a very different role, and what that might mean, even particularly in the context of what happens going forward. And then just to bring in Martin as well in terms of his involvement in North-South affairs.
Hello, Martin.
Yes. Just move on. Okay, we'll do. We'll get to Martin at some stage, hopefully. I think I might be right in saying he's maybe I actually don't even know what Martin looks like, but he's the younger person in terms of involvement in North-South affairs. So, but we'll get back to that. I suppose. Did I say something there I shouldn't have? And then in terms of, I suppose, involvement, Mary, coming back to you, those key challenges, in terms of trying to foster North-South cooperation, at those early stages, what you faced and how you overcame them, what were the main things that were an issue?
Well, whenever I joined the NSMC Secretariat in 2005, the executive in Northern Ireland was in suspension, and the North-South bodies had been established, but they were in what was called care and maintenance, or warm storage, all this language that had developed around. Just let them sit there and we'll get back to it later whenever things settle down. But the biggest challenge for me personally was the political situation in Northern Ireland, which made it very difficult to progress this agenda because, as you can imagine, the different political parties had very different views about North-South cooperation. So that was a challenge. And at the same time, as time went on, another big challenge was the change in political and socio-economic climate in the south of Ireland, with the financial crash and the implications of that for the government in the south. So it was a very turbulent period. But thankfully, we got established properly in 2007, and that's when the real work began. And that was with Dr. Paisley and Martin McGuinness as the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, and Bertie Ahern was the Taoiseach at that stage. So it took a few years to get through, to get proper devolution going and working. And after that, it did take off a lot better, but not again without challenges to do with, could we talk about this, could we talk about that? Is it the North or is it Northern Ireland, which used to be a very common one when we came to be writing the plenary reports. And we did get there, and a lot of that was down to officials in both organisations, in the North and in the South, who were determined to make it work. And I would single out Martin, actually, as one in particular who did great work behind the scenes to try to progress the agenda. And without that, and without those relationships that developed between the officials in the North and the officials in the South, it wouldn't have worked. But it did work, and we're now on a different plateau, which is very good.
Are there things, I mean, even trying to establish what was in common and then what you couldn't touch, how did you even address those challenges in terms of, like, was it clear straight away of the things that had to sit to one side if you were going to get it to move?
Well, we just had to work on it, let's put it like that.
Yeah.
There were some things that weren't going to happen very much, but by and large, I think both the main political parties in Northern Ireland at that time were prepared to make it work, but not to rock the boats too much. But it did work. And again, it's all down to relationships, working with people, trying to persuade them, political advisors, senior civil servants, everybody. It was all slowly, and eventually things began to settle. And they're much more settled now.
Yeah, and in terms of, what would your view be on that, Tom, in terms of those early stages and the lessons that you learned, in your time?
Lessons learned. I think the first lesson I would have learned going into the North-South Ministerial Council after some exposure to it was patience. When I went in, issues like Narrow Water Bridge, the Ulster Canal, the A5 road were all under active discussion. They're still under active discussion. Even although, now I think there's considerable advances. And at the same time, when you go in, you do see the potential for North-South cooperation. It's vast, and it's so undeveloped, and it's still quite undeveloped. And looking around, you can see so many areas where cooperation, intensified cooperation, is in the interests of both sides. And yet it takes an enormous amount of time and energy to move things forward, even quite slowly.
Yeah.
I sometimes think it would be quicker to build the Great Wall of China than to build a bridge between North and South. Patience is one element. And I think maybe as we go on and if the institutions remain stable for a reasonable amount of time and we get to trust one another more, trust was mentioned quite a bit earlier, things might accelerate a bit. Another thing that struck me at the time was in our arranging North-South sectoral meetings, they were always very sensitive, very delicate. There was a lot of discussion about language and where people would sit and how long they would and so on and so on. But when the politicians, no matter what shape or origin they were, when they actually met one another, the mood was always very good. In some ways, the politicians got on easier than we civil servants. And we were always so conscious of potential mistakes, fault lines. But when the politicians were in the room, pragmatism tended to dominate. And finally, one thing that struck me, and Mary might be the same, in Armagh you have a cohort of civil servants from Dublin and a cohort from Belfast working side by side. So in each sector, whether it's education or health, there's an officer from the north, there's an officer from the south. And the two civil services have to work alongside one another. So the Northern Civil Service, to me, always seemed better organised. They examined issues more thoroughly. They were more practical. Whereas in the South, we were a lot less formal, but we were more flexible. So you tended to learn from one another. It would be a fascinating study if somebody wants to do it, of how the two civil services actually mesh in Armagh. But it was a very positive experience because I think that we did learn from one another.
Yeah, I think that the difference in this, as someone who works across the border, I find it fascinating watching the two jurisdictions from a public sector stroke civil service perspective, and how, how they approach things, and you can see the benefits of, in Northern Ireland we're very formulaic in how we approach things, and there's arguably because we're a region as opposed to, I think is that part of the issue, that at the end of the day Northern Ireland's a region, Ireland is a country in terms of lots of things, or does that not really matter?
There was a lot of, the explanations are many, but I think in the north, like Mary was the servant of two masters and had to balance different views in the executive, whereas I had a much more straightforward path in Dublin. And I think this particular situation in Belfast understandably made northern civil servants more cautious and more reluctant to move at any pace, whereas in the south we didn't face the same issues. But we could be quite sort of, we wanted to proceed in the south at times without proper analysis, or that the north was quite keen on. We wanted to rush forward. So it was an interesting experience for the two of us to work side by side.
It was a challenge. It was a challenge, I find, because in the north, depending on who the minister was, it made it easier or harder for the civil servant. If the minister was very keen to pursue the north-south agenda, that reflected through in the civil servants, and vice versa. But even for me, working in Armagh with southern civil servants was a challenge as well, because the southern side, for want of a better word, was always very keen to push as far with the agenda as possible. And I was very conscious that I had to a certain degree, hold back on certain issues, because I knew they just wouldn't work as far as the political system was concerned. So the Irish side of the Secretariat was always, to me, wanting to push us, and I was always trying to hold back and try to balance. But it worked. And again, I come back to this word relationships. Tom and I get on very, very well. And the civil servants in Armagh get on very, very well. And that's what made the difference. And it's the same right through all aspects of North-South cooperation. If people can develop good working relationships, things can get done.
Would that be your experience, Michael, watching it from a different perspective in terms of, maybe from the outside in a wee bit?
Yeah, well, I'm listening as very typical. I was the guy with the private sector mentality. Yeah. Wondering, what the hell is wrong with you guys? Can't you see the benefits, and why aren't you pursuing them with energy and determination? And on the other hand, at a human level, understood the frustrations of individuals like the joint secretaries, like the chief executives of North-South bodies, like everyone else who's in charge of an organisation trying to ride two horses. And I suppose this is the point about the interjurisdictional piece. And this is why I was so taken by the idea of the European single market, that in the economic space, there weren't two horses now. There was one horse for a business person. You had that free movement of capital, you had the free movement of service, of goods, people, etc. And therefore, you could treat it as a single market, which allowed you to get on and make decisions about investment, about hiring people, about where you sold your goods, how you put together your supply chains. And all of that was happening both through the 90s and the noughties, right? And even when people were earlier mentioning about the downturn in interest in North and South, and I felt that as well, meanwhile, out there in the marketplace, it was still happening. And when we had to post-breakfast start counting stuff and putting numbers and value, suddenly we discover we've an all-island market worth 8 billion, 10 billion, 11.1 billion now. That's not far off the subvention for Northern Ireland, okay? So for me, I felt frustrated that not enough attention was being given to the necessities and modalities of how that side of the process worked, and how that was going to be sustained into the future, right? I understood the frustrations and the importance of people trying to make it happen, but still I thought that the point in the agreement, first paragraph, talks about collaboration. Yeah. Not just action. And Andy Pollock asked me one time, Michael, what's the difference between cooperation and collaboration? Well, I said, Andy, cooperation, we can have a discussion, we can agree it's a good idea, and we can go away and do nothing about it, and there's no consequences. Yeah. With collaboration, we have to agree what we do, and we share the responsibility. And if it works, we share the credit, and if it doesn't work, we both get hit on the head. Yeah. And I think there's not enough talk about collaboration as distinct from cooperation as a result.
And it's interesting because it was, even looking at the North-South Ministerial Council remit, the three things I mentioned are consultation, cooperation and action.
Action.
You know, and again, even it struck me the point made around the things that were on the table, you know, a long time ago are still on the table. And, you know, that kind of frustration around the lack of movement on them. And, you know, in terms of, you know, how do you translate into action some of this, or how do you try and move it on more, you know, more quickly, you know, from what your observations of what you've tried to do, you know, in the past with this? You know, why does it take so long, I suppose?
I mean, from my perspective, the NSMC and its mechanisms are incredibly bureaucratic and time-consuming. I mean, to take a decision, you have to go up and down chains of command, and everything is in writing. Various ministers have to agree, and so on. But I think it was made deliberately cumbersome and bureaucratic because of its political sensitivity. So there was a sort of an effort to slow everything down, and it was quite successful because everything did slow down. Yeah. And because of the bureaucracy in Dublin, when I would go to Dublin and to departments in Dublin with various ideas or proposals, I tended to encounter a huge amount of inertia. I mean, the system wasn't opposed, but not greatly enthusiastic about getting involved. Like, departments in Dublin would have had multiple demands on their priorities. There was a lot of domestic stuff, there were resource issues, there were money problems. But I think somebody said earlier, like, North-South cooperation would require prioritization. It would have to be built into every facet of your work. And that wasn't really the case. And I think to some extent departments in Dublin were reluctant to get too involved because they saw once you started to get involved, you started sinking in this morass of bureaucracy, and it took forever. So things were very slow. But I think in Dublin, and still the case, at the highest political level, like with the Taoiseach at the time, Bertie Ahern, or Micheál Martin as Foreign Minister, or Dermot Ahern as Foreign Minister, there was high-level political engagement, but it didn't translate into very enthusiastic action in the bureaucracy. And as Mary said, I think Martin Fraser played a key role in trying to drive the bureaucracy forward. And I think things have got easier, but it's still not, we're still not there. The priority still isn't given to North-South cooperation. The priority that it should be there, but it's not there yet.
Because I mentioned earlier, just around, I think, Anthony, that idea of a new common chapter, you know, just is that considered a big loss in terms of, you did when it was there, did it mean anything? And now it's not. You know, what's necessary to try and just having been involved in work on cross-border mobility, you know, and that idea of trying to embed, you know, that sense of the importance of making, particularly now as the UK starts to deviate from EU law, etc. How do you get those issues embedded, that a decision taken does take into account cross-border? Michael, have you a view on that?
Oh, yes, I have. I think that there's a concept I believe in economics of sort of macro, meso, and micro. And at the macro level, it's in place. We have the institutions, and Brexit showed how important the institutions are, because they couldn't go away. They had to be kept, they had to be worked, and the matters on the table for the institutions had to keep working. And at the micro level, this room is testimony to just how much cooperation, collaboration, action is going on: public health, education, business, the economy. Almost every area in the mapping exercise, somebody is thinking about doing something in regard to North-South cooperation. But what we're talking about is this meso piece, the institutional piece in the middle. And I think we need to go back to the principles and the spirit, right? I'm thinking about celebration. Like, the greatest moment of all-Ireland celebration we had recently was the Olympics. And it seemed to me very few commented on the identity piece. I think I'm the first person to use that word. Identity was so important in the earlier discussions, and reconciling different identities and people's sense of different identity. And we had Team Ireland, people in Northern Ireland choosing GB, Team DG, Team Ireland. I remember there was a picture, I think it was Newton Ards, of us both being celebrated by the local community. But that spirit of inclusiveness, of being British or Irish or both, or no matter what your ethnic origin, could go only so far. When it came to looking at the Olympics in Northern Ireland, you couldn't access RTE. Right? So when you come into the real world where people have to sign contracts, people have to do deals, people have to agree things. And that's where the real difficulties are. And I think now, going forward, we have a real challenge. I think there's an opportunity in the reset. I've written a paper that's up on the CCBS website about the challenges that we face in this regard. And the key to it is the institutional interplay. We have the Windsor Agreement, we have the Good Friday Agreement, we have an agreement between the British and Irish government on a reset, the priorities they set. All of those run across and touch upon many of the areas that you're all working in North-South currently. So how the government, in this previously uncharted water of the UK being outside the EU and Northern Ireland being somewhat outside, somewhat inside, this is like going back to 1999. This is like we have to think about how do we make this work for everyone in this room and for the people that you're all working for and for the economy that's underpinning all this and allowing the minister to be so, dare I use the fluhulach, do you know that Irish word with his large S? But money is money. You can't do things without money, but money needs to be used wisely. You need to have the possibility to use it. You need to be underpinned by governance and regulation, and all that needs the systems that you have worked as Joint Secretaries to work much better and to figure out how they're going to interact in this new institutional interplay with London, Brussels, Dublin, and even Washington. And I think that's a real challenge for everyone in this room to get engaged with that and to broaden that perspective, north-south, east-west, EU. That's our challenge now.
I suppose, Tom, you've been involved with EU affairs, so how have you, in terms of EU exit, and the kind of complications, arguably, that will bring, or has and will bring, continue to bring, how do you reconcile that with the whole concept of North-South cooperation, or what kind of challenges does that bring to the fore, because it does add a further, potentially very significant layer of complexity in the two?
Oh, it's definitely changed everything. I think the trade implications of Brexit for the island of Ireland are still working themselves through. But as Michael said, the European Union doesn't stay still. It's a dynamic body and it's changing all the time. And looking ahead, I think the Brexit is done and we live with the consequences. But when you look at the new von der Leyen Commission, its priorities now are going to be this thing called strategic autonomy or digital sovereignty. It's all a posh word for protectionism. So the EU is starting to turn in on itself and it's going to become more protectionist. And the second big issue going to arise is enlargement. So the Union is going to turn east and there's going to be long, complicated debates about taking more member states in and the cost of it. And all of this is going to have significant implications for the UK, for Northern Ireland, for us in the South. If the Union is going to become more protectionist and put up barriers, they're going to go up against Britain. Yeah. Whereas the North staying in the customs union won't be so affected. But there will be barriers that will have to be dealt with. So as Michael was saying, all of this really, what it requires now is a much more intense discussion between London and Dublin and Belfast about what's going to happen down the road. And it starts with the review of the agreement in the 2026. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement will be reviewed. And then what are the implications of a European Union that is not the sort of global open trading arrangement that we're used to, but is somewhat different? And what are the implications for the north of this and the south and Britain? And the three of us together need to work out some sort of joint approach to this. And I don't know whether that dialogue, the reset and the fact there's going to be summits between Dublin and London, and we've got the plenary meetings of the NSMC, the machinery is all there. Yeah. But we do need to start this discussion urgently now.
And I suppose it raises issues around, for me, Mary, when I watch it, and it's the point Michael made as well, a lot of this is already happening on the ground, and the people on the ground know what doesn't work, but there's a sense that doesn't make its way up to where it matters in terms of trying to actually prepare for change and to think through what policy should look, a bit like, the Windsor Framework was designed, but nobody did a risk assessment of it, in terms of what was going to happen to the things that, things obviously that have started not to work with it. So, Mary, in terms of you watching this over time, is there anything different, what needs to be different now in terms of the fact that you do have some very big issues ahead in terms of the cooperation and the widening of cooperation?
I think in terms of the NSMC as an institution, Tom touched on this earlier, there's a need to move away from a lot of the bureaucracy associated with the NSMC and allow it to become a proper forum for discussion, ministers to ministers. When ministers get together, they do talk to one another and they do work as politicians. But to run NSMC meetings, the amount of paperwork and nonsense that goes on, I can say that now that I've retired, is incredible. It really is incredible. I remember, this is a side, when the first big plenary with Dr. Paisley and Martin McGuinness was held in Armagh, which was a major, big event. I had the job of writing the brief for Dr. Paisley, and I had followed the lead of my late Peter Smith, down to saying, you 10 minutes, 5 minutes, so on, so on. And Dr. Paisley was reading through and he says, what cheeky civil servant said that I could only talk for 5 minutes on this? And it suddenly dawned on me that how ridiculous that all was. And that still goes on to a large extent. And we have to let the politicians talk openly and freely to one another. And whether we like it or not, they're the ones that have got to agree, and they're the ones that have to make the change. And while we can all work hard as officials and as community organisations, as north-south bodies and all the rest of it, the big decisions about whether or not the money goes to the A5 is taken at ministerial level. And hopefully that decision will be taken and we'll be able to say, yeah, we did it. And all of that is down to politics. And politics, I think, will need to change, particularly in light of what Tom says in relation to the changes at EU level and what's happening there. And the way the world is changing with technology. Where are we at in terms of considering the implications of AI technology across all these different sectors that we're working in? Where are we at in considering how to effectively deal with climate change and pollution of the rivers and pollution of the seas? All of these big worldwide issues have got to move further and further up the agenda so that we're not bogged down talking about stuff that's very, very local, and while important to people in local areas, isn't really about where we need to move as an island and move forward.
And I suppose one for you all as well, do you think the priorities in terms of that idea of cooperation are still the same, or do you think you mentioned the whole kind of AI digitization, should the priorities be different now? And in a sense, and again, I look back over the council meetings, the NMSC meetings, and I was kind of thinking, is this changing enough?
It has to change.
What do you think the priorities are?
It has to change because I was saying to Tom, do you remember the number of meetings we had to discuss waste management? It was a huge issue at the time. But these big issues that I've talked about, science and innovation, how to grow the economy, how to share work on our health and our caring services, how to innovate in education, like the Minister was talking this morning. These are the big issues that are facing an island and an economy in a world that is changing. Who knows what's going to happen when we have the next election in the US, who will be the new president, what's happening in the East with wars and all that's going on there. So we have to lift the game up to the big issues and less of the smaller but important local issues. That's my view.
This is maybe where I paid you a compliment earlier, Martin, to say about you being the young one. So, and it's maybe a good point to bring you in terms of, we talked about kind of your, the different roles in terms of North-South cooperation, but Mary raises a very important challenge to how you actually move cooperation to a different level, because there's so many layers now to cooperation. That's almost, you're getting layers built on top of layers, as opposed to it's, arguably just being about Ireland and Northern Ireland and how they cooperate. So, I mean, what would be your view on what the priorities are in terms of North-South cooperation and how you build that in?
Hi, Maureen. Sorry, I hear you earlier on, but I can hear you now. Maybe Mary Bunting's voice broke the internet and I could begin to hear what everyone was saying. I was getting all nostalgic because I remember Dr. Paisley harumphing at this cheeky civil servant who told him what to say and how long to take saying it. Probably should have done that in the 60s, Mary. It might have helped us out. But anyway, I can declare a long-standing interest, Maureen, in this topic, going back over 20 years with Tom and Michael and Mary and a lot of people in the room there, I'm sure. But I think it is right to talk about the future. And I was looking at the plenary communique, those much under-read documents, and it seems to me, though, the last two NSMCs are the first ones I haven't been at plenaries probably for the best part of 20 years. That the agenda has moved on, and I see stuff about mother and baby homes and institutional abuse. I see stuff about climate and biodiversity, and we would have fought hard back in the day to have those type of things on the agenda. So I think things are loosening up, which is good. But I think Mary's right to talk about the outside world as well. We're going to have to deal with AI and digitization, and the island is going to be, I think, tossed around in a lot more storms in the years to come. And I think the politics is going to have to catch up. And I heard again, Mary, I didn't hear Tom or Michael earlier, but the bureaucracy is going to have to unburden the politicians, and the politicians are going to have to use that freedom to deal with the issues that are ahead of us, rather than maybe the issues that we all agreed we'd talk about in 1998 or in 2006.
And what would you say about, the challenges and the things that haven't been delivered and they're still on the table? How, again, given, obviously, a different government in terms of the UK, etc. How do you try and move on the things that just seem to stay there forever? And arguably now some of those things should do, because then, for example, cross-border mobility, that's something that should be reviewed on an ongoing basis. How do you make sure the island works in terms of that all-island labour market? But there are obviously projects, like Narrowwater, A5, etc., that are still they're still a work in progress. How do you move them on?
Yeah, I'm probably getting a bit old for this business. I'm becoming an optimist in my old age. So I like Narrowwater is definitely much further along than it used to be. The A5 is a source of great frustration to me, but it's stuck for pretty conventional, non-political reasons, I think, to do with planning and cost and so on and so forth, which I find frustrating. But it is what it is. The A5 will move on when the northern system can get over the planning and funding issues, and the southern system can sort of meet them wherever they have to meet them. But I'm sort of optimistic. Like I was listening to the Deputy First Minister at an event in Oxford a few weeks ago, and she was talking about the future all the time, and I didn't hear your contributions earlier, but the executive seems to be much more future oriented than it was, which I think is good. Probably maybe that's the next generation as much as anything else. But I think more things are moving than not. I also think, maybe it was because it was the Deputy First Minister I was listening to, who would have worked indeed with myself, Mary and Tom, and back in the day, and I wouldn't have been as probably amenable to some of the stuff we're doing now as she was back then, because that was the politics. But I think we underestimate the huge challenge of getting the DUP and Sinn Féin together, of getting Sinn Féin to support the police, to get the IRA campaign ended and decommissioning, and then Brexit. And I was listening over the 20 years since myself and Mary would have been in rooms with M. Pengelly. So many big hurdles have come up, some of them pre-existing, if you like, the things about ending the Troubles and moving on, and some of them new, and like Brexit is the big one. It was such a threat to everything. And I appeared at the CCBS conference a few years ago with the British Cabinet Secretary when I was the Irish Secretary to the government, and at that point I was talking about trying to save a way of life in the border region, and I was saying that as a thing that had yet to be achieved in terms of Brexit. So I think day to day, week to week, year to year, it's very frustrating. But I think if you looked at 5-year bites we're in a much better place. But I do think with no election in prospect in the north for a few years, and with hopefully the worst of Brexit behind us, that the next one, and the south, well funded, if I may put it that way, that the opportunity in the next 5 years has to be grasped. Both to do things that could have been done a long time ago, but also to make sure we're ahead of the curve. I mean, the island has a great opportunity. Its geographical, political, economic location in the world, but also if we start taking any of it for granted, or if we want to refight old battles, we will be overtaken. This is the one thing I notice in London. In London you see the world more clearly than you do in Dublin and Belfast, and you see Russia and the impact that has on the Eastern European states in particular, but the EU in general. You see the impact of China. You see the power of countries like India, Brazil, South Africa. You see their attitude to the West, and we have to keep up with that and try and stay ahead of that. So, and I say the island has friends everywhere, north and south, and they will help us. But we have to help ourselves, and we can't afford to stay stuck for too much longer. I think
Yeah, I mean, a concern. I think for me there is a concern just about that deviation between the two jurisdictions and some big legislative issues. That could make North-South cooperation more difficult. So arguably, the sentiment is there, but will it actually transfer into action whenever it comes to thinking about things on a cross-border basis? And making sure things function properly in that way. And it is more challenging again because Northern Ireland's obviously a region, and some of that legislation is out of Northern Ireland's hands in terms of how that operates again, from that all-island perspective. Is that something that, in terms of consciousness of how you actually address that, is there enough, are the bodies, or are they the kind of is there something in place to make sure that that's actually looked at properly?
So I think that's a challenge for sure. It's always been a challenge, working in Dublin most of my life, to get people to think about Northern Ireland or North-South cooperation. There are so many other things to think about, and it can be, frankly, a bit frustrating sometimes dealing with the types of things Mary was describing. On either side of the border, it's certainly a bit thankless at times. But getting the system in Dublin to think about that is a challenge. I actually have another challenge, which is getting the system in Dublin to think about Britain outside the EU, because so much of our interaction in terms of trade, business, regulation was in a common area called the EU, the Customs Union, the Single Market. So the Southern government is going to have to think quite hard about how it interacts with Britain. Yeah. But the good news is the government in London is much more positively disposed. The executive in the north is more positively disposed, and the politicians in the south certainly are very positively disposed. But it's hard yards. I mean, and again, apologies if this came up earlier, but some of the work that the Assembly and the Executive are expected to do in the post-Brexit world is far beyond anything they would have ever had to do in the past, and it's very difficult for a small administration in Belfast and a relatively small one in Dublin to deal with this increasingly multipolar world, both in terms of the institutional relationships, the stuff that Tom would have done in Brussels, added to the bilateral stuff with Britain now, added to the outside world, added to the new technologies. It's difficult, but look, that's the job. We have to do it. It tends to rely on too few people trying to bang the drum, but lots of people will tell you that, there will be people, I can assure you, who think we don't focus enough on disability or on health or on equality or on the climate or whatever else. So it's an ongoing battle to keep this on the agenda properly. But the good news is, between the Windsor Framework in terms of EU, UK, and the NSMC being back, that provides a great focus, because at least now we know that every member of the Irish government is going to have to go to a plenary meeting chaired by the Taoiseach and the First and Deputy First Minister, and most of them will have to go to several sectorals a year, and that's the best way I know of getting official level attention to things,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose conscious of time, but what do you think, Michael, the path ahead is for all of this? In terms of, particularly, we've actually highlighted significant, progress challenges but opportunities too. What do you think the path ahead of this for this is?
So picking up what Martin said there, I think staying the same, there's tremendous achievements that we've got, right? And as sports people in the audience will know, that's great when you lift the cup, but then the next season you start again. And we're back at the next season, and we have to do things differently, as Martin says. The fundamentals, the world has changed fundamentally, but our fundamentals haven't changed. We're still an island. We still have the opportunities of economies of scale, proximity and conditions, our identity and the strength of our democratic institutions. And that's really a big thing in today's world. We mustn't allow agitators who seek to divide us, like through racism and other things, to infect this and bring back political violence in a different way. From the economic perspective, we need to revamp and upgrade the fundamentals. Our all-island labour market is not functioning optimally. That involves everyone in this room. It involves potentially everyone on the island to have the opportunity, as the Minister said, to be educated and then work wherever they wished. Our energy system needs to be upgraded. We don't necessarily have the governance to underpin this transformation into renewable energy, climate change, all the things we talk about. We don't talk enough about them in that joined up all-island way. Education, health, public well-being, I could go on the list. Behind it, there's the money. And I want to just give a small example of ambition versus lack of ambition. So everyone's talking about our recent ECJ court decision and the 12 billion, that 14 billion, whatever it is, that we have in addition. Well, if the state had decided to put that money into Apple shares as distinct from bonds, we'd be talking about 64 billion. That's the scale of the increase in the value of Apple. And that's just a proxy for the way the world has changed. The scale of what's out there in terms of money and what we have to adjust to. We have to adjust our mindset that our little island, to compete in this space and gain what we all want, which is to sustain the prosperity that's underpinning peace, need to do things differently. We need to get the systems effectively interplaying between the institutions. We need the private sector to be engaged in this. We need every other stakeholder in this room part of that conversation. And we need to do it on that fundamental three strands within Northern Ireland, North-South, East-West, and now with the EU out in a different relationship and a different way. And if we don't do that, we will be in trouble, because what we've achieved may slowly slip ineluctably away from us.
What would you say, Mary, in terms of the path ahead? What do you think is the priorities in terms of how you make sure cooperation grows as opposed to contracts here?
The priorities, I think we've all covered it more or less already, but it is about trying to think bigger in terms of what NSMC can deliver and encouraging the politicians to continue to work together. And as Martin said, I think the last two plenaries showed that things much better. The plenary, the most recent one, the report that came from that, I read it and I thought, my goodness, this is a step ahead from what it used to be. So the priority is to keep the institutions working, to get rid of a lot of the bureaucracy and to focus on the real big ticket issues that are going to impact on the island of Ireland over the next, whatever, as long as we're still here, she said, hopefully.
Tom, what would you say?
I haven't much to add from what the others have said. I sometimes wonder if Brexit, despite all its difficulties, was a sort of wake-up call. Like it was sprung on us, and Europe wasn't expecting it, we weren't expecting it. And when London started to engage in the discussions with Brussels on Brexit and the negotiations, there was no consultation with Dublin, there was no real consultation with Belfast either. And I think we all have a sort of folk memory of this now, and we don't want to get caught again. So I think the politicians are wary now. They don't want another nasty surprise down the road. And Europe is changing quite rapidly, as I said. There's all this stuff about strategic autonomy, protectionism, that's going to have significant implications for all of us. And it's very much now in our interest to talk to one another at a high level about these sort of challenges, and not to become meshed in all the paperwork and the bureaucracy of the NSMC, but to let the politicians at it and to prepare ourselves for dealing with the quite significant challenges that are down the road. But maybe Brexit will act as an encouragement. We don't want to find ourselves in that situation again.
Yeah. Martin, just a final word from you, if that's okay, in terms of the path ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with Michael and Mary and Tom. I mean, in essence, the North-South story or the East-West story should be the same as what any, institution and democratic institution should do, which should look after the welfare of the people, and it should look to the future. And so it is exactly that, navigating that very complicated world we're in and using the best of our advantages at whatever dimension, north, south, east, west, on the island or the islands. And that's of course economics, it's productivity, it's infrastructure, it's also education, and I think it's services like health as well. If they're done better with north-south cooperation or east-west cooperation, that's what we should do. So it's what any democratic institution should be trying to do, look to the future and make a better future for everybody.
Thank you. I'm going to I think we have a few minutes, if that's okay, just to throw it open to any questions that anyone would have, just for the panel members. Yes, we've one just down the back there, thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Bernie Hannigan, Chair of the Institute of Public Health. Just to highlight something relevant to the very optimistic point that the panel has reached at this stage, and that is some work produced recently by colleagues from the IPH on a document on the economy of well-being, which was a report brought out by the IPH and the EuroHealthNet. And that highlights the trend and the considerations, not just in Europe, not just here, but globally, opportunities to put the health and well-being of people as a focus for economic development, moving away from growth and GDP as the primary outcomes of business. Now, I know Michael is smiling and perhaps thinking, this is more things put on the public sector. But I think we can have a real sweet spot and synergy between the objectives of the public sector and the private sector here. And that document, which is available on publichealth.ie, makes recommendations for work that can be done in the north and in the south towards this shared goal. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, it's interesting because, again, when you start to look at cooperation at different levels, you can see cooperation even in terms of skills accreditation now. So it's happening. It's happening in a very piecemeal kind of way. And I think some really good cooperation gets lost because it happens at a level that seems to not make its way, to the politicians to be known, or it's ad hoc. But there's some really great examples out there of really good practice in terms of cross-border cooperation. Would anybody else like to ask a question? Or thank you.
By the way, Michael is concerned about the health and well-being of his 4 granddaughters now, so I'm very much invested in the health and well-being of future generations.
Thank you. My name is Jonathan Walsh. I work as a customs and trade consultant. There's a comment as well as a question. I was very conscious listening to all the speakers and listening to Michael in particular about what we've seen in kind of disruption and change over the last few years and the things that we've seen in terms of changes of government. And we've had a number of very important announcements made by the new UK government in the last few days and weeks about shelving and reviewing plans and funding because of major holes in funding availability and allocations and so forth. And they're not always coming through, to the public as much as they're coming through to those who are impacted directly by it. For example, we had an announcement in the last few days about the plan to shelve indefinitely this idea of putting not-free EU labelling on products in Great Britain, which I personally believe is going to have a monumental impact on consumer choice and cost in Northern Ireland in the next 6 months to a year, and that will in turn bring a social impact. So my question is about, with the elections that we had, where we had a change in government. So early this year started with the Safeguarding the Union paper from the previous UK government. And again, by the way, that common chapter was highlighted about its removal. But I also point out to people that the command paper is an argument in your head with yourself. Nobody else knows about it. You know, it's a one-sided conversation. But when we've seen changes and plans, casement was a big one as well. And we know that there's 2 big elections coming up this year, the US and of course here at home as well. Where is that stability, security, continuity, consistency that we all need? And I'm hoping that the answer is in the institutions that have been formed as part of the Good Friday Agreement, because it all anchors back to that. But, you know, business makes the world go round. You know, business is where we do trade, and it's people, as I said earlier on, and those movements are happening. But we need consistency in guidance, and we need to be able to have conversations. I'm fortunate enough to have been able in May to be over when NI Trade had their reception that Martin hosted in London. We need to know that those conversations that we had, that when we come out of the room, that what was discussed and what was agreed actually still applies. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. I know Jonathan is embedded in the whole trying to understand Windsor framework and its rollout at the moment. So I know that's something that he's obviously got a lot of expertise in. So Michael, do you want to take that one?
I think that you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. And it's kind of, dare I use the word, elephant in the room is, and again, I don't think anyone else has used the word choice. And it's choice, there's a competition in a way. Safeguarding the Union I've read, then you know what it said about the all-island economy, that it doesn't exist, it's not real, 11 billion is somehow a figment of someone's imagination. That's a choice to whether actually we really are going to bring that into the seriousness of agreements that underpin contracts and people put investment into things to make them happen. Right? There's a choice. I've actually watched the Democratic Scrutiny Committee in the Assembly consider matters and watched how there's this interplay again about identity, and either an exclusive identity that sees only a relationship with one trading partner versus a multipolar identity that actually sees multiple relationships with different partners being the best way to go forward, which is in fact at the heart of the agreement. It's the choice for politics in Northern Ireland. Stephen in the front row knows this, he's navigated this all the time. But it's a choice that needs to be influenced by people in this room highlighting the importance to stability, as you said, to our capacity to deal with the external instabilities that are coming at us from various elements of economic change, of political change, of change on the continent, etc. And I think that fundamentally, I'm hoping that the relationships we built up over the last decades, particularly through Brexit, where we did manage ultimately to navigate through to an agreement, are going to what's to enable us to do that. I think the interaction of stakeholder interaction, we haven't mentioned that. It's the element of the strand 2 that was never initiated, was the engagement of civic society, reaching out to people in this room so that politics had the interaction of the people who were impacted by their decision in the rooms, not just the wonderful civil servants who wrote tremendous communiques that actually articulated that what was agreed would be said outside the room. And I think that's the realism that has to come into this debate now. But choice, some people are going to have to make serious choices about where they place their decisions.
I think
and
also
I think that's an important discussion.
It emphasises the role of the cross-border bodies as well. I think it kind of, escalates it, and Margaret would definitely be knee-deep in that in terms of what's happening now and the challenges that Intertrade have in terms of trying to navigate, all of these changes taking place and making sure cross-border trade works. Just very briefly, would anybody else like to have a final say before we get our lunch? But just to say thank you, thanks to the panellists for a great conversation, and I think it's something that hopefully will keep on going. I think it's needed, particularly in current kind of state of affairs. But and thanks to Anthony and everyone, and enjoy your lunch.
Thank you.
Thank you.